Tyler Grant stood outside the downtown cafe and checked his phone for the fifth time that evening, and the screen showed 7:30, which meant Lauren was already 15 minutes late, and he tried not to feel nervous, but his palms were sweating, despite the cool autumn air, and he wiped them on his jeans and hoped she would still show up. 3 weeks ago, he had matched with Lauren on a dating app, and at first he thought she was too good to be true, and her profile showed a beautiful woman, with dark hair and pale skin and eyes that seemed to look right through the camera, and her bio said she enjoyed long walks at night and classical music and deep conversations about life and death. And Tyler had almost swiped left because it sounded pretentious, but something made him swipe right instead. Their first conversation had lasted until 3 in the morning, and Lauren asked him about his work as a marine biologist, and she seemed genuinely fascinated by his research on dolphin communication, and she asked questions that showed she actually understood what he was talking about, and that never happened on dating apps. And Tyler found himself opening up about his dreams of discovering new ways. Animals talk to each other, and Lauren said she found human communication equally fascinating. Over the next 3 weeks, they texted every day and had video calls twice. And Lauren always called late at night, which she explained was because she worked odd hours for her family business, and Tyler did not mind because he was usually up late anyway, working on research papers, and during their calls, Lauren would ask him about his childhood and his family and his fears and dreams, and she listened in a way that made him feel truly heard. Now, here he was waiting to meet her in person for the first time, and he had chosen his favorite cafe because it was public and safe, and had good lighting, and he wore his best casual outfit, which was dark jeans and a button-down shirt and a leather jacket that made him feel confident, and he had even gotten a haircut that afternoon and told himself this was just a normal date with a normal person. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and it was the kind of expensive vehicle that Tyler only saw in movies, and the tinted window rolled down slowly, and there was Lauren, and she looked exactly like her photos, but somehow more intense, and her skin seemed to glow in the streetlights, and her smile showed perfect white teeth, and she leaned toward the window and called his name. Tyler walked over to the car and started to say hello, but Lauren interrupted and said the cafe was too crowded and too noisy, and she had a better idea, and would he mind if they went somewhere more private? And Tyler hesitated because every safety article he had ever read said never get in a car with someone you just met. But Lauren looked at him with those deep eyes and said she understood if he was uncomfortable, and she could give him the address, and he could meet her there. Something about the way she said it made Tyler feel silly for being cautious, and he told himself he was being paranoid, and Lauren seemed nice, and they had talked for weeks, and what was the worst that could happen? And he opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat, and the interior smelled like leather and something sweet he could not identify, and Lauren smiled wider and said she was so glad he trusted her. The car pulled away from the curb, and Tyler noticed the driver was a woman with silver hair who did not say anything or even look at him, and Lauren saw him staring, and explained that was her sister Victoria, who was giving them a ride, and Tyler said hello. But Victoria did not respond, and Lauren laughed softly and said Victoria was not much for small talk, and then she put her hand on Tyler's knee and asked him about his day. Tyler talked about the lab and the new data they were collecting on whale songs and how he thought they might be close to a breakthrough in understanding complex animal language, and Lauren listened and nodded, and sometimes she squeezed his knee gently, and her hand was cold even through his jeans, and Tyler noticed they were leaving the city and heading into the hills where large estates sat behind iron gates and tall walls. He asked where they were going, and Lauren said her family home, and they could have dinner there, and it would be much more comfortable than a noisy restaurant. And Tyler felt his stomach tighten because this was moving fast and he barely knew her, but he also did not want to seem rude or cowardly, and Lauren seemed to sense his hesitation, and she said her sisters would be there too, so he would not be alone with her, if that made him more comfortable. The word sisters made Tyler relax a little because that meant other people and safety in numbers, and he asked how many sisters she had, and Lauren said 12, and they were a big family and very close, and Tyler whistled and said that must make holidays interesting. And Lauren laughed, but it sounded strange, and she said holidays were always very special in their family, and they had traditions going back centuries. The car turned onto a long driveway lined with old trees, and their branches created a tunnel overhead and blocked out the moonlight. and at the end of the driveway was a mansion, and it looked like something from a Gothic novel with tall windows and stone walls and gargoyles perched on the corners, and Tyler laughed nervously and said this place was incredible and asked if her family was royalty or something. Lauren said something like that, and the car stopped in front of massive wooden doors, and Victoria finally spoke, and her voice was cold and smooth. And she said they had arrived and Lauren should take their guest inside, and the way she said guest made Tyler feel uncomfortable. But he pushed the feeling down and told himself he was being paranoid again. Lauren got out of the car and walked around to open Tyler's door, and she offered her hand to help him out, and Tyler took it, and her skin was ice cold and he almost pulled away, but she held firm and led him toward the entrance, and the doors opened before they reached them, and Tyler could not see anyone inside, but he heard movement in the shadows. Inside the mansion, the air was even colder than outside, and it smelled like old books and dust, and something metallic that reminded Tyler of blood. But he told himself that was ridiculous, and the hallway stretched far into darkness, and portraits lined the walls, and they were all of women, and they all had the same pale skin and dark hair and predatory eyes. And Tyler asked if these were all family members. Lauren said yes and walked him deeper into the house, and their footsteps echoed on marble floors, and Tyler tried to make conversation and asked what her family business was, and Lauren said they were in acquisition and had been for a very long time, and Tyler did not know what that meant, but before he could ask, they reached a set of double doors, and Lauren pushed them open. The dining room was enormous, and a long table dominated the center, and 12 women sat around it, and they all looked up at once when Tyler entered, and they all had the same pale skin and predatory smile, and they all stared at him like he was the most interesting thing they had seen in years. And Tyler felt every instinct in his body screaming at him to run. Lauren gestured toward the table and introduced her sisters one by one, and she started with the woman at the head of the table and said, this was Victoria, who Tyler had already met. And Victoria nodded slowly, and her silver hair seemed to shine in the candlelight, and her eyes were ancient despite her young face, and she said they had been expecting him. The other sisters watched Tyler with varying expressions, and some looked amused, while others looked hungry, and one looked almost sad. And Lauren pointed to each one and rattled off names and numbers, and she said Catherine was number 2, and Diana was number 3, and so on, until she reached herself at number 13, and Tyler tried to smile and said, this was quite a family reunion. Number 5, whose name was Helena, stood up and walked toward Tyler, and she moved in a way that was too smooth and too graceful. And she circled him slowly and asked Lauren where she had found this one, and Lauren said online like always. And Helena laughed and said the internet had made hunting so much easier. And Tyler felt his blood run cold at the word hunting. He tried to laugh it off and said, that was a weird joke, and asked what she meant by hunting. And Victoria spoke from her seat, and her voice cut through the room, and she said there was no point in pretending anymore, and Tyler deserved to know the truth before they began. And Lauren looked uncomfortable and said they usually did not do this part, and they usually just took what they needed. Tyler backed toward the door and asked what they were talking about, and his voice came out higher than he intended, and his heart was hammering in his chest, and he could feel adrenaline flooding his system, and every survival instinct he had developed over millions of years of human evolution was telling him to run and run now. Victoria stood and walked toward him, and her movements were faster than should be possible. And one moment she was at the table, and the next she was right in front of him. And Tyler stumbled backward and hit the wall, and Victoria tilted her head and studied him like a scientist studying an interesting specimen. And she said they were vampires, and they had been alive for centuries, and they needed blood to survive. Tyler laughed because what else could he do, and he said vampires were not real, and this had to be some kind of elaborate prank. And maybe he was on a hidden camera show, and he looked around for cameras but saw only shadows and flickering candlelight and the 12 pairs of eyes watching him, and none of them were laughing. Lauren stepped forward, and her face showed something like regret, and she said she was sorry, and she had wanted to scare him. And she had actually enjoyed their conversations, and under different circumstances they might have been friends. But this was what her family did, and what they had always done, and humans were food, and nothing more. The word food hit Tyler like a punch, and he asked if they had done this before and how many people had sat in this room and never left. And Diana, who was number 3, said they had lost count centuries ago, and it used to be harder when they had to hunt. in the streets, but now people just volunteered to come to isolated locations with strangers. They met online. Tyler felt sick and angry and terrified all at once. And he thought about all the missing persons cases he had heard about and wondered how many had ended in rooms like this, and he also thought about his research partner, who knew he was on a date tonight, and who would notice if he did not show up for work tomorrow, and that thought gave him a small spark of hope. He tried to stay calm and asked why they were telling him all this and why not just attack him and get it over with, and Victoria smiled, and it was not a nice smile, and she said they had been doing this for so long that it had become boring, and sometimes they liked to play with their food and see what humans would do when they realized they were prey number 8, whose name was Sophie, said they should stop wasting time, and she was hungry, and it had been 3 days since their last meal, and Lauren had promised them someone special, and Tyler definitely did not look special, and Lauren defended him and said he was smart and interesting and worked with dolphins, and Sophie rolled her eyes and said she did not care about dolphins. Tyler's mind raced through everything he knew about vampire mythology, and he tried to remember if any of it was based on truth, and he thought about sunlight and crosses and garlic and wooden stakes, and he had none of those things, and he was in a mansion full of predators who were faster and stronger than him, and the only exit was blocked by Lauren. But Tyler had not become a successful researcher by giving up when things looked impossible, and he had spent years studying how animals survived in hostile environments and how prey species outsmarted predators, and he knew that intelligence was humanity's greatest weapon, and he just needed to think and observe and find a weakness. He noticed that the room was full of candles, and there was a large fireplace with iron tools, and the walls were covered in old tapestries that looked dry and flammable, and there were heavy curtains over the windows, and the furniture was antique and probably worth millions, and the vampires seemed very proud of their home. Tyler also noticed that despite their supernatural abilities, the sisters seemed overconfident and bored, and they had clearly done this many times and expected it to go the same way every time, and they were treating him like he had already lost, and that was a mistake because underestimating your opponent was the first step to defeat. He decided to buy time and learn more, and he asked Victoria how old she really was, and Victoria seemed pleased by the question and said she was born in the year 1247, and had been turned when she was 25 and had spent the last 7 centuries building her family and collecting her sisters, and each one had a special talent. Catherine spoke up and said her talent was speed and she could move faster than the human eye could track, and Diana said her talent was strength and she could bend steel with her bare hands, and Helena said her talent was persuasion and she could make humans do whatever she wanted with just her voice, and Tyler filed all this information away. Lauren said her talent was empathy, and she could feel what humans felt, and that was why she was so good at luring them in, and she could sense Tyler's fear right now, and also his determination. And she found it fascinating that he was not begging or crying like most humans did, and Tyler said he had been in worse situations, and that was a lie, but he said it with confidence. Number 11, whose name was Rachel, said she doubted that, and asked what could be worse than being dinner for 13 vampires, and Tyler said he had once been trapped in a sinking research vessel 300 feet underwater, with only 10 minutes of oxygen, and he had survived by staying calm and thinking clearly, and he planned to do the same thing now. The sisters looked at each other, and some seemed impressed while others looked annoyed, and Victoria said she liked his spirit, and it would make the hunt more interesting. And then she explained the rules, and they would give him a 5-minute head start to run anywhere in the mansion, and then they would come after him, and if he survived until dawn, they would let him go. Tyler knew this was a lie, and they had no intention of letting him leave alive, but he also knew 5 minutes was 5 minutes, and that was 5 minutes to find a weapon or an exit or a way to turn the tables, and he asked if they promised to honor the rules, and Victoria said she had not broken a promise in 700 years. Sisters all smiled, and they stood from their chairs in perfect unison, and they formed a circle around Tyler and began counting down from 300, and Tyler did not wait for them to finish, and he bolted from the room and ran down the dark hallway, and behind him he heard their laughter echoing through the mansion. Tyler ran through the dark hallways, and his footsteps echoed on the marble floors, and behind him he could hear the sisters counting, and their voices were cold and amused, and he knew he had maybe 4 minutes left before they came after him, and he needed to make every second count. The mansion was a maze of corridors and rooms, and Tyler tried to remember the way back to the entrance, but everything looked the same, in the dim light, and he passed portraits of stern women in suits of armor and ancient weapons mounted on walls, and he grabbed a sword from one display, but it was heavier than expected and slowed him down, so he dropped it. He turned a corner and found himself in a library, and the room was massive with books covering every wall from floor to ceiling. And there was a fireplace and a desk and several reading chairs, and Tyler's researcher brain noted that some of these books looked hundreds of years old and probably priceless, and then he remembered he was running for his life. Tyler checked the windows, but they were locked and reinforced with metal bars, and he tried to force them open, but they would not budge, and he looked around the room for anything useful and saw a letter opener on the desk, and it was silver and sharp, and he grabbed it and put it in his pocket. And then he noticed the fireplace had iron pokers. He took the heaviest poker and felt its weight, and it was solid and could be used as a weapon. And he also noticed the fire was still burning, and there were extra logs stacked nearby, and an idea started forming in his mind. And he remembered that many old vampire stories mentioned fire as a weakness. Counting had stopped, and Tyler heard footsteps, and they were fast and getting closer. And he looked for another exit and saw a second door at the far end of the library, and he ran toward it and pulled it open and found himself in a narrow servants' corridor, and the walls were plain stone and there were no decorations. This corridor was darker and colder, and Tyler moved quickly but quietly and tried to control his breathing, and his heart was still pounding. But he forced himself to think clearly, and he needed a plan because just running would not save him, and the vampires knew this house and he did not. He heard a voice behind him, and it was Helena, and she was calling out that she could smell his fear, and it smelled delicious. And Tyler moved faster, and the corridor opened into a kitchen, and it was enormous with industrial-sized ovens and counters and hanging pots and pans. And Tyler realized they probably did not use this kitchen much, since they did not eat normal food. The kitchen had multiple exits, and Tyler chose one at random and found himself in a wine cellar, and rows of bottles stretched into darkness, and the air smelled like old wood and fermentation. And Tyler heard footsteps above him and realized he had gone down stairs instead of finding a way out. He looked around frantically and saw the wine cellar had small windows near the ceiling, and they were at ground level outside, and Tyler climbed on top of the wine racks and tried to reach them, but they were too high, and the racks swayed under his weight, and bottles crashed to the floor and shattered, and wine pooled on the stone floor. The noise brought them, and Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, and her eyes reflected light like a cat, and she smiled and said she had found him. And she descended the stairs slowly and deliberately and told Tyler there was nowhere left to run, and he might as well make this easy on himself. Tyler backed away, and his foot slipped in the spilled wine, and he caught himself on a rack, and more bottles fell, and Sophie laughed and said, "Humans were so clumsy." And she moved toward him, and her movements were predatory and confident, and Tyler gripped the iron poker tighter and waited. When Sophie lunged, Tyler swung the poker and caught her across the face, and she stumbled back and looked more surprised than hurt. And she touched her cheek where a red mark was forming, and she said that actually hurt, and no human had hurt her in decades, and now she was going to make his death slow. But Tyler had learned something important, and iron could hurt them, and that meant they were not invincible. And he swung again, and Sophie dodged easily, and she was much faster than him, and she grabbed the poker and yanked it from his hands and threw it across the cellar, and then she grabbed Tyler by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Her grip was like iron, and Tyler could not breathe, and he clawed at her hand, but it was like trying to move stone, and his vision started to go dark around the edges, and he thought this was it, and he had tried, but it was not enough. And then he remembered the letter opener in his pocket. Tyler pulled out the silver letter opener and stabbed it into Sophie's arm, and she screamed and dropped him and stumbled back, and smoke rose from the wound, and she looked at her arm in shock, and the silver was burning her flesh, and Tyler scrambled away and grabbed the iron poker and ran back up the stairs. He burst out of the wine cellar and nearly ran into Catherine and Diana, and they had been coming to help Sophie, and they looked at him with new respect, and Catherine said he had actually hurt one of them, and that had not happened in a long time, and maybe he would be fun to hunt after all. Tyler did not wait to chat, and he ran in the opposite direction, and he could hear them following, and they were not even running fast, and they were playing with him and enjoying the chase, and Tyler knew he needed to change the game and stop being prey and become something else. He found a bathroom and locked himself inside, and it had a small window. But again, it was too small to climb through, and he looked around for supplies and found cleaning chemicals under the sink and towels and a mirror, and another idea formed, and he started mixing chemicals. The door exploded inward, and wood splinters flew everywhere, and Diana stood in the doorway and said hiding in a bathroom was pathetic, and she reached for Tyler, but he threw the chemical mixture in her face, and she shrieked and clawed at her eyes, and the mixture was burning her, and Tyler pushed past her and ran. He was back in the main part of the mansion, and he tried to orient himself, and he thought he remembered the way to the dining room, and if he could get there, he could reach the front door, and he ran down a long gallery, and the portraits watched him with dead eyes. Victoria appeared at the end of the hall, and she was not running, and she just stood there blocking his path, and Tyler skidded to a stop and turned around, but Catherine was behind him, and he was trapped. Between them and Victoria said the game was over and he had done well. But now it was time to feed. Tyler looked around desperately and saw he was standing under a massive crystal chandelier, and it was held up by a thick chain, and Tyler had an idea, and he looked at the wall and saw a rope that controlled the chandelier height, and he ran toward it and pulled with all his strength. The chandelier came crashing down between him and Victoria, and crystal shattered everywhere, and candles fell, and one landed on an old rug, and flames started spreading, and Victoria jumped back and her dress caught fire, and she beat at the flames and screamed in rage. Catherine rushed toward Tyler, but he grabbed a burning piece of carpet and threw it at her, and she dodged. But the flames spread to the curtains, and suddenly fire was everywhere, and the old mansion was burning. And Tyler realized he had found their weakness, and he was going to burn this whole place down if he had to. The fire spread faster than Tyler expected, and the old mansion was like kindling, and flames raced up the walls and across the ceiling, and the heat was intense, and smoke filled the hallways, and Tyler pulled his shirt over his mouth and nose and tried to see through the haze, and he could hear the sisters screaming, and it was not the confident predatory sounds from before, but genuine fear. Victoria appeared through the smoke, and her dress was still smoking, and her face was twisted with rage, and she said Tyler had destroyed their home and killed their history, and he would pay for this with centuries of torture. And she moved toward him, but a burning beam fell from the ceiling and blocked her path, and she hissed and backed away. Tyler ran toward where he thought the entrance was, and he passed the dining room and saw the long table was on fire, and the portraits on the walls were burning, and centuries of vampire history was turning to ash. And he felt a grim satisfaction, because these creatures had killed countless people, and now their legacy was burning. He found a staircase and went down instead of up, because smoke rises and he needed air, and the basement level was cooler and darker, and he could hear water dripping, and he thought maybe there was a way out through a basement exit or window, and he moved carefully because he could barely see. Behind him he heard footsteps, and it was Lauren, and she called his name, and her voice was sad and angry, and she said she had actually liked him, and this did not have to happen, and if he just stopped running, she would make his death quick and painless. And Tyler shouted back that he was not interested in any death, quick or otherwise. Lauren appeared from the shadows, and her pale skin was smudged with soot, and her eyes glowed in the darkness, and she said humans always fought, but they always lost in the end, and vampires had survived for thousands of years, and they would survive this too. And Tyler said maybe, but they would have. To find a new mansion. He threw the iron poker at her, and it hit her shoulder, and she stumbled, and Tyler ran deeper into the basement, and he found a room full of old furniture and paintings and things the family had stored away, and he also found a small window near the ceiling, and it was open, and fresh air came through. Tyler started stacking furniture under the window, and he climbed up on a dresser and reached for the window, and his fingers brushed the frame, and he pulled himself up, and the window was small, but he thought he could fit, and he started squeezing through. Hands grabbed his legs and pulled him back down, and he fell hard on the pile of furniture, and Lauren stood over him, and she was crying, and she said she did not want to do this, but her family was everything, and he had taken that from her, and now she would take everything from him. Tyler kicked at her, and his foot connected with her face, and she fell back, and he scrambled up again, and this time he grabbed a heavy painting and swung it at her, and the frame broke over her head, and she went down, and Tyler did not wait to see if she would get up, and he climbed back onto the furniture. He pulled himself through the window and his jacket caught on the frame, and he heard fabric tear, but he kept going and his shoulders barely fit, and for a moment he thought he was stuck. But he twisted and pushed, and suddenly he was through and falling, and he hit the ground outside. Hard Tyler rolled and stood up and looked around, and he was on the side of the mansion, and the front was around the corner, and he could see flames coming from windows and smoke pouring out. And in the distance he heard sirens, and he started running toward them. He made it around to the front and saw the massive doors were open, and some of the sisters were fleeing, and they moved like shadows and disappeared into the night. And Tyler knew they would survive and rebuild and find new hunting grounds, but at least tonight they had lost. A fire truck pulled up the long driveway, and then another, and police cars followed, and Tyler ran toward them and waved his arms and shouted, and a firefighter saw him and ran over and asked if he was okay and if anyone else was inside. Tyler said there were 13 women, but he did not know if they got out, and the firefighter wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and led him away from the burning building. And Tyler's legs felt weak and his hands were shaking, and the adrenaline was wearing off and everything. Heard a police officer asked him what happened, and Tyler started to explain but stopped because how could he tell them the truth, and they would never believe him. And he said he had been invited to dinner and the house caught fire and he barely escaped, and the officer wrote this down and asked for the name of the family who lived there. Tyler gave Lauren's name, and the officer looked confused and said, according to their records, this property belonged to a shell corporation and had been abandoned for years, and Tyler said that could not be right, because 13 women lived here, and the officer said they would investigate, but right now they needed to focus on the fire. More emergency vehicles arrived, and firefighters worked to contain the blaze, but the mansion was old and dry and the fire was winning. And Tyler watched as centuries of vampire history burned, and he thought about all the people who had died in that house and hoped their ghosts were free now. A paramedic checked Tyler for injuries and found cuts and bruises and smoke inhalation, but nothing serious, and she said he was lucky to be alive. And Tyler laughed because luck had nothing to do with it, and he had fought for every second of survival and used every bit of intelligence and creativity he had. He asked if he could use a phone and called his research partner, whose name was Kevin. And Kevin answered on the first ring and asked where Tyler was and said he had been worried. When Tyler did not answer his texts, and Tyler said it was a long story, but he was okay, and he needed a ride. Kevin arrived 20 minutes later and stared at the burning mansion and asked what happened, and Tyler said he would explain on the way home, and they drove away, and Tyler watched the flames in the side mirror until they disappeared around a curve back at his apartment. Tyler took a long shower and washed away the smoke and soot and blood, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw scratches on his neck where Sophie had grabbed him and bruises on his arms and legs, and he looked like he had been in a war, and in a way he could not sleep, and instead, he sat at his computer and started researching, and he searched for missing persons cases and unsolved disappearances and patterns of people who vanished after meeting someone online, and the more he searched, the more he found, and it was worse than he thought. Tyler found forums and chat rooms where people shared stories of supernatural encounters, and most were dismissed as crazy or attention-seeking, but some rang true, and he found others who claimed to have survived vampires or werewolves or other creatures, and they all said the same thing and nobody believed them. He created an account and shared his story, and within an hour he had responses, and some people said he was lying, and some said he was insane, but a few said they believed him, and they had similar experiences, and they shared information and warnings and ways to protect yourself. One user sent him a private message and said their name was Rita, and she had been hunting vampires for 10 years after they killed her brother, and she said if Tyler was serious about stopping them, she could teach him. And Tyler thought about Lauren and her sisters and all their future victims, and he replied, yes. Over the next few days, Tyler learned that the mansion had burned to the ground, and no bodies were found, and the police investigation went nowhere, and the property was seized by the city, and there was no record of the family who had lived there, and it was like they never existed. But Tyler knew they existed, and they were still out there, and Lauren had said they had centuries to find him, and he believed her. And he started preparing, and he learned about weapons and tactics and vampire lore, and he trained and studied and became something he never thought he would be, and he became a hunter. 6 months passed, and Tyler's life changed completely, and he still worked at the marine biology lab during the day, but at night he trained and researched and hunted, and Rita taught him everything she knew about vampires, and Other creatures that hid in the dark and fed on humans. Rita was tough and smart, and she had scars that told stories of battles won and lost. And she said Tyler was lucky, because most people who encountered vampires did not survive to tell about it, and the fact that he had escaped 13 of them using only his brain and basic weapons meant he had potential. They met in person for the first time at a diner in Nevada, and Rita was smaller than Tyler expected, with short dark hair and eyes that never stopped moving and watching, and she carried herself like a soldier, and Tyler learned she had been in the military before her brother died, and she used those skills to hunt monsters. Rita showed Tyler her weapons, and she had silver knives, and iron chains and wooden stakes and bottles of holy water and salt. And she explained what worked on different creatures, and vampires were vulnerable to silver and fire and sunlight and decapitation. And she said the key was never fighting fair, because they were stronger and faster and had centuries of experience. Tyler told Rita everything about that night in the mansion, and she listened carefully and asked questions about the sisters and their abilities and their behavior. And when he finished, she said, he had made several smart choices but also several mistakes, and if he wanted to survive the next encounter, he needed to learn. She taught him how to fight, and not normal fighting, but fighting to survive against opponents who were faster and stronger and could kill him in seconds, and she taught him to use his environment and to always have an escape route, and to never let pride or anger cloud his judgment. They trained in abandoned warehouses and empty parking lots, and Tyler learned to move quietly and strike quickly and retreat before the enemy could counter. And Rita said, vampires expected humans to be slow and scared, and the best weapon was surprise and aggression. Tyler also learned about the vampire world, and Rita said they were organized and had territories and rules, and the 13 sisters were part of a larger family called a coven, and covens sometimes worked together, but more often competed for hunting grounds and resources. Rita said the sisters would be looking for Tyler, but they would also be dealing with the loss of their home and their reputation, and in vampire society, losing to a human was shameful, and they might go into hiding for a while, but they would eventually come back, and when they did, he needed to be ready. Tyler asked why Rita did this and why she spent every night hunting creatures that could kill her, and Rita was quiet for a long time, and then she said because someone had to, and because every vampire she killed meant lives saved, and her brother's death would not be meaningless if she could prevent others from suffering the same fate. Months turned into a year, and Tyler became skilled at tracking and fighting and surviving, and he worked with Rita on several hunts, and they found a young vampire in Oregon who was leaving bodies in the woods, and they tracked him to an old cabin and killed him with silver and fire. They discovered a nest of vampires in Colorado who were taking homeless people because they thought no one would notice, and Tyler and Rita freed 2 prisoners and burned the nest, and the vampires scattered, but 3 died in the flames. Tyler learned that the vampire world was vast and ancient, and humans were mostly unaware they were living alongside predators, and he wondered how many missing persons cases were actually murders by creatures that should not exist, and the number was probably terrifying. He also learned he was not alone, and there were other hunters scattered across the country and the world, and they shared information through encrypted channels and warned each other about dangerous covens and new vampire activity, and it was a small community, but dedicated. One night, Tyler received a message from an anonymous account, and it said Lauren was looking for him, and she had been asking questions in vampire circles and offering rewards for information about his location. And Tyler felt a chill run down his spine, and he knew the time had come. He told Rita, and she said they should disappear and move to another country and start over. But Tyler said no, and he was tired of running. And if Lauren wanted to find him, then she would, and he would rather face her on his terms than wait for her to surprise him. Rita said that was stupid and brave and exactly what she expected from him, and she would help him prepare. And they spent weeks setting a trap, and they found an abandoned factory outside the city and rigged it with cameras and weapons and escape routes, and they let word leak through vampire channels about Tyler's location. The trap was simple, and Tyler would be alone in the factory and appear vulnerable, and when the vampires came, they would find themselves in a building designed to kill them, and Rita would be nearby with backup, and Tyler knew it was risky. But he also knew he could not spend his life looking over his shoulder. 3 weeks later, the cameras picked up movement, and Tyler was in the factory pretending to work on his laptop, and his heart was pounding, but his hands were steady, and he had come a long way from that terrified man running through a burning mansion. The door opened and Lauren walked in, and she was alone, and she looked the same as that night, but her eyes were harder and colder, and she said she had been looking for him for a long time, and Tyler said he knew, and he had been waiting. Lauren said she did not want to kill him, and she wanted him to join them and become a vampire and live forever, and she said his intelligence and survival instincts would make him powerful, and together they could rebuild what he had destroyed. Tyler said no, and he would never become a monster that fed on innocent people. And Lauren's face twisted with anger, and she said he was just food that got lucky and his luck had run out, and she moved toward him with supernatural speed. But Tyler was ready, and he pressed a button on his phone and iron bars dropped from the ceiling and created a cage around Lauren, and she slammed into them and the iron burned her skin and she screamed in rage and said this would not hold her. Tyler said it did not have to hold her forever and just long enough, and then he pressed another button and UV lights flooded the cage, and Lauren shrieked and her skin started smoking and she fell to her knees and Tyler watched without emotion. He asked her how many people she had killed and how many families she had destroyed, and Lauren said she lost count centuries ago, and Tyler said that was the difference between them and he would remember every victim and fight for every life. Lauren said her sisters would come for him, and Victoria was already planning revenge, and they would never stop hunting him. And Tyler said he was counting on it and he was hunting them too. And this war was just beginning. Rita entered the building with 2 other hunters, and they had silver chains and wooden stakes, and they secured Lauren and took her to a location where other captured vampires were held and studied and questioned, and Tyler did not ask what happened to them after that. He went home and took a shower and looked at himself in the mirror and saw someone different from a year ago, and that scared marine biologist, who just wanted a normal date, was gone, and in his place was a hunter, who had seen the darkness and chosen to fight it. Tyler returned to work the next day, and his colleagues asked where he had been, and he said he had the flu, and they believed him. Because why would they not? And he went back to studying dolphin communication and writing papers and living a normal life on the surface. But at night he trained and hunted and saved lives that would never know they had been saved, and he worked with Rita and other hunters, and they formed a network that grew stronger every month, and they shared the truth that most humans never saw, and the world was more dangerous than anyone knew. Sometimes Tyler thought about what his life could have been if he had never swiped right on Lauren's profile, and if he had never gone to that mansion, and if he had never learned the truth. And maybe he would have been happier living in ignorance. But then he thought about the people he had saved and the vampires he had stopped and the difference he was making, and he knew he would make the same choices again, and humanity needed protectors, and he had been given a chance to be one. Tyler kept a photo on his phone of the burning mansion, and sometimes when things got hard, he looked at it and remembered that night when one human with nothing but his wits and determination had escaped 13 ancient vampires and burned their home to the ground, and that memory reminded him that humans were not helpless, prey, and they were survivors and fighters and builders and explorers, and they had climbed to the top of the food chain not through strength or speed, but through intelligence and tool use and cooperation. The vampires had centuries of experience and supernatural powers, and they thought that made them superior, but they had forgotten that humans had something more important, and they had the ability to adapt and learn and change, and every generation of humans was different, but every vampire was the same. Tyler knew the war would never truly end, and there would always be creatures in the dark, and there would always be humans who fought them, and he had found his place in that war, and he would fight for as long as he could, and somewhere out there, the 12 remaining sisters were rebuilding and planning and hunting. And Tyler was ready, and he had gone from prey to predator, and from victim to hunter, and from a man looking for love to a man fighting for humanity. The story of Tyler Grant was not a love story, and it was a war story, and like all wars, it was fought in the shadows by people no one knew about, and the victories were quiet, and the losses were buried, but the fight continued, and Tyler continued, and that was enough.